Hi, my name is Kirk with Jensen Brothers Off-Road. In this video I'm going to show how to rebuild an ST strut and some of the steps and precautions that I take while doing so. I have already disassembled this strut, cleaned all of the parts thoroughly and removed the seals. If you'd like to see a video showing how to disassemble a strut, please refer to the STX Complete Rebuild video. I have here some of the new seals and O-rings that I'm going to be using in this install. Please note there are some differences. The piston seals, instead of a cream color, are now a teal color. I often reuse the wear band on the piston. The shell O-rings are cream color instead of black. Same with the piston O-ring. The rod seal is also that same teal color instead of the cream color. This one on the bottom has just been stained blue by the oil. And the bump stop, instead of one quad ring, now has two quad rings. And I also reuse that spring usually. The older ST struts, like the early version STX struts, used this rebound damping assembly that required calibration. You'll find these in all struts older than 2016. There are also some important differences between the old lower cap and cylinder design and the new one. The old one on the bottom uses an O-ring installed into the bottom of the threads of the lower cap. The new design has a snap ring, flange, and an O-ring that seals on the top of the threads of the lower cap. It sits right here on this ledge. The old one sits in the bottom. The critical sealing surfaces of the cylinder on the new design is here below the flange and here on the old design of the ST strut and the early model STXs. If these surfaces have a little bit of surface rust, they can be polished up with 300 grit sandpaper if needed. I'll begin the reassembly by installing the rod seal and wiper into the lower cap. To do this, I use a little bit of a lubricant on the rod seal groove. Use my rod seal installation tool with the U-cut part of the seal facing out. Then install the wiper. And the O-ring will actually go down in the bottom as I've shown before. Just like that. And I lubricate that extremely well because that can't get cut upon reassembly. If it gets cut, you'll have an internal leak problem again. I'll use Parker Super Lube to lubricate the rod seal in between the rod seal and the wiper and the bore of the lower cap. This stuff is supposed to work quite well to reduce stiction in the strut. Directions of the Parker Super Lube say you don't need a lot, but I use a liberal amount. I found that this works better than the Lucas Assembly grease or the Lucas Assembly lube. On the piston there are two sealing surfaces for the top seal and the bottom seal that require some attention if you want these struts not to leak internally. I usually polish these with 800 grit sandpaper on a lathe. You could probably spin it on a drill if you found a way to hold it. You just want to make sure that there's no scratches from or tool marks or vertical scratches from the seals. Sometimes the seals get loose and they'll leave vertical scratches on this surface and they have to be polished. If the scratches are too deep, the piston should be replaced, and I will note that the new pistons are a little bit better than this one. I'll grab one and show you. They actually have a hard coat anodized to protect the sealing surface from scratches. And this one doesn't have it, but there's a bump ring here as well. And there's a large chamfer on the bottom side for the new Rebound damping assemblies. And they also come with the new style bump stop. When I replace the piston seals, at least on the lower side, it's very useful to have this tool. It just gives the seal something to ride on so that you're not messing up the seal on the threads or overstretching it. And then install the wear band. And the upper seal can usually be applied by hand. And then the bump stop, I like to put a little bit of lubricant on the actual inside bore. There's a shelf in there that holds the bump stop in place by those quad rings. Now we can install the piston shaft into the lower cap. You want to be careful when you're doing this not to cut your wiper seal. Usually start on one side, pull it back a little bit, and then just kind of work it back and forth until I can see the lip's not curled over. Inspect it all the way around and then push straight down. Now we can install the piston onto the piston shaft. I usually secure the piston shaft into the vise and help give it a little bit more grip using a strip of leather or glove or whatever you have. Clamp that fairly tight. I don't want it to slip when I'm using my impact tools. Looks like I forgot my piston O-ring. Use a small amount of Loctite on the top of the piston threads near the O-ring. You don't want to use any more than that, otherwise the piston will never come back off. When installing the cylinder onto the piston, I use a fair amount of the same Parker Super Lube on those piston seals. I pack in a good bit of it. I use it both on the piston seals and on the inside of the cylinder. And now these old cylinders, they have identical ends, and you'll want to pick the side that has the better quality sealing surface. In this case it looks like it's this side. It's shinier than the other side and there's no tool marks. So this side will go down, and that seal and that O-ring in the bottom of this lower cap will seal against that surface and prevent any internal leaks. Something that's important when installing the cylinder on these older ST struts is that this is a sharp lip and it will cut this seal. If that seal gets cut, you will have an internal leak. So I use a rounded off flat blade screwdriver, and I carefully, starting on one side, I use the screwdriver and I walk it around being very careful not to let that upper seal get cut by the cylinder. When you've got it right, it should just fall on. If you have to force it, you've more than likely cut the seal. There it goes. Two more things that I usually do on older ST rebuilds is I add an additional O-ring if there's a spot for it on the lower cap. Slide this all the way down. It's identical to the O-ring that goes on the top. And that'll slide into the small shoulder that's right down there. And then I add a little bit of thread sealant to the bottom of the threads. Make sure that goes all the way around. I try my best not to use too much of this. Now this is only something that I do on the older designs for the STs, because the new STX struts with the flange design do a better job of preventing internal leaks. This was more of a temporary fix until that new design came out. But it seems to be working on all the rebuilds that I've done so far. And if you're not looking to pay a ton of money on upgrading all the parts inside your struts, this isn't a terrible way to do it. And I've had good luck with it so far. Making sure that the cylinder is threaded down all the way and seated properly is important, because you don't want the O-ring in the bottom of the lower cap to get cut. To do that, I'll usually start it off by hand until I can feel it start to compress the O-ring. And I've already lubricated that O-ring and the cylinder the best I could. Okay, I felt it start. Let's transfer to the other side of the vise. If you don't have one of these sets of vise jaws, which you most likely won't, you can use strap wrenches. One on the lower cap and whatever you can come up with to tighten the top. I use a custom-made wrench to grab onto that cylinder, and I usually plug the top with something so that I don't crush it. These older ST struts don't have this compression valve to plug the hole with, so just be careful with it if you use something that clamps onto the threads. But if you use something out of steel, just make sure that you use some sort of shim to protect the cylinder. And something that I do to make sure that the O-ring doesn't slip inside of the cylinder and get cut is I pull this all the way down until I can hear metal to metal, like that. And then I want to thread this down until it stops. I want to actually feel it stop. And I'll check it again to make sure I'm still hearing that metal to metal. That means the O-ring didn't get pinched underneath that cylinder and get cut. As you're probably seen by now, the two problematic areas for internal leaks are the piston seals and that O-ring in the lower cap. Same for the newer design. All of the design is slightly different. It's still the two most problematic areas, here and here. Now that the cylinder is seated properly and screwed down, we can proceed to fill the upper chamber with the proper amount of 5-weight oil that ORI currently recommends, in combination with the teal-colored seals. The older piston seals and the older 2.5 weight oil in combination was found not to be compatible with one another over a long period of time, or about 2 years. Something that we noticed was that the 2.5 weight oil would actually cause those seals to swell and loosen up. And when that happens, the seals are allowed to move vertically up and down the piston. And that can cause the internal leak that we have been running into. So we will use this oil and the amount called for in the fill chart. If you don't know what size you have, you can always fully extend the strut, and it will be the same length as the stroke. So this measures 14 inches. This is a 14-inch strut. I've already pre-measured the oil for 107 milliliters, and we'll just pour that into the upper chamber through the main cylinder. We'll install the small O-ring that goes on the cylinder to seal the upper cap from the cylinder. This O-ring keeps air from getting sucked past the wrong part of the upper cap. It's supposed to go through the brass bypass tubes and into the main cylinder, and that keeps air from getting sucked in between the threads in the upper cap. Now that we have the proper amount of oil, we can install our shell O-rings. Always lubricate all seals with either an assembly lube or an equivalent grease so that the O-rings don't tear when you screw things together. These older STs only had 12 brass bypass tubes instead of the 19 that the STXs have, and in combination with the compression valve. That is the difference between an ST and an STX. And what this allows the STXs to do is have a velocity sensitive compression valve. When the strut hits something hard enough to close this valve up against the top of the upper cap, it restricts oil flow through these holes along the outside and blocks off the middle hole. And I can tune an STX strut to have a stiffer or softer secondary compression hit based on how many holes and the size of these holes around this compression valve. ORI factory currently is making 2 different valves that will be optional for future purchases. This ST version does not have that, so I'll just continue putting it back together here. Okay. Before pouring the oil into the piston shaft, we're going to check the lower mount to make sure that it has the proper calibration. The manual calls for an 8/1000 gap, but I found that a 5/1000 gap gives a much better adjustment on the tightest setting, and a little bit tighter over the whole range. If it's at 0.008 or 1/8007 inch, I've noticed that the loosest three settings don't really make much of a difference when you turn the screw. At least with the 5/1000 gap, I can feel a difference between each setting. So we'll go ahead and check this one. This one's adjusted to 5/1000. With a slight drag on the feeler gauge between the jam nut and the pin. So this one's perfect. And that is with this column of parts at its loosest point. There should be a very slight movement on the tightest setting. This screw has to be all the way clockwise to make that adjustment. So since this did not come apart, we're going to put it back in exactly like we took it out. If you do have to reassemble the lower mount, you just want to use just a few drops of Loctite on the inner tube to screw into this damper body, and you want to make sure there's no residue on the face of this damper body when you screw those parts together. And then use a few more drops on the inner tube on this side as well. Screw everything hand tight. It doesn't have to be super tight, just tight enough that they won't come apart. And you should probably let that dry for about 30 minutes after applying Loctite, so that when the oil touches it when it's inside of the piston shaft, it won't loosen up the Loctite. If done properly, when taken back apart, the parts sometimes stay together, but many times, at least half of the time, these parts will all come disassembled when you remove the lower mount, usually because you're using an impact wrench or a hammer and a crescent wrench to loosen it. Now to fill the piston shaft with the proper amount of Spectro 10 weight shock fluid. This 10 weight oil is what is recommended for an ST strut. That's what the manual calls for. Some people use heavier oils, but with the ST strut, it's not really necessary to use different weights of oil when you can just make a different calibration on your jam nuts. With the newer STX struts, they call for a 5 weight oil Spectro, same as the top, and there's no calibration with those, so in order to make adjustments, you have to use a different weight of oil most of the time. Another difference between the rebound damping assemblies on these older struts and the new ones is the floating valve on the rebound damping assembly. On the older version, it's actually screwed to the stack of parts or to the rebound assembly, and it's just floating in here. On the new design, it's separate. It doesn't attach to the assembly at all. You have to drop it in a spring first into the piston before you drop the assembly in. Another really important note when working on these older struts is these have to be super clean. There can't be any debris in the oil in the piston shaft or on this assembly. Otherwise it'll get wedged between the metering plate and damper body, and that will cause the rebound damping not to work very well and make the oil foam really bad. So just make sure everything is really clean when you put it back together. Before you insert the rebound damping assembly into the piston shaft, you have to cycle this a few times to get the oil sucked underneath the lower cap and leave it compressed as much as it will stay. Then you can make sure your spring is straight, or as straight as it can be, and go ahead and install your stack. Now that the strut has been cycled and it's as far up as I can get it, the oil won't overflow out of the piston shaft when I screw this down. We'll use an impact wrench to put that back on. I grip the piston shaft in the same way I did before, and I grip about 4 inches below the lower mount so I'm not clamping onto the threads. That makes them difficult to remove and makes it not as effective when you're installing them. To test the strut, I fill the lower chamber and upper chamber the same way that the manual calls for. I'll fully compress the strut before filling the lowers. Put about 40 psi in the bottom so that there's a positive pressure on the oil. Without that positive pressure, the rebound damping won't work. And that's actually what keeps the oil from foaming on the top and the bottom, is a positive pressure. And now fill the upper until it's at a height that I can easily compress. Maybe a little bit less than that. Right now it's on its tightest setting. We'll try the loosest setting all the way counterclockwise. And we'll leave it in the middle for the customer. And you should be able to feel a difference between all of those settings. This one seems to be working really well, so it is done. Thanks for watching.